Alright, I got something else for y'all today. First I'm going to turn this thermocell on. I was sitting here yesterday at this time reading this, and I got eat up with mosquitoes. Well, I'll give it a minute and see. Alright, so I got something here today. Yesterday when I sat here and started reading a little out of this, I said Sasquatch, I said science meets legend, and I realized when I was going through it and putting it on the video editor that I had said it backwards. So it's legend meets science. But anyway, I've only been doing this since 2019. And there's things that I've heard, like when I mentioned yesterday the Jerry crew, that he was finding footprints in California. Let me get to that part real quick. Okay, when a bulldozer operator named Jerry Crew, so I've heard that before, Jerry Crew, he was finding the big footprints and made a cast of it, and then that became known as Bigfoot. Then everybody started calling it Bigfoot after it was in the media then. Alright, so I've never heard the full story until I read this right here, and this is a little bit long, so but I want to read this to you. So if you've never heard the full story, this is going to be real interesting. Alright, so this part here is actually about Ray Wallace. He was the contractor that owned the construction company that was doing the work. Jerry Crew was one of the bulldozer operators. Alright, I see the light on it now, so it should help. I'm already seeing a couple more little mosquitoes flying around. But that's on. It's on. I can tell now it's on. I've seen the orange light in it. Okay, so I'm going to read this. The phone rang, interrupting my grading of term papers. A voice introduced himself as Bob Young, a staff reporter for the Seattle Times. He was writing an obituary for Mr. Ray Wallace, who passed away on November 26, 2002 in Centralia, Washington. I recognize the name. So this is Jeff Meldrum. This is Dr. Jeff Meldrum that's writing this right here. So so I recognize the name. So Wallace had been the contractor on the Bluff Creek road job in Humboldt County, California, back in 1958. So his brother Wilbur was the foreman on the job. After enormous human-like footprints began turning up intermittently at the construction site, one of the seasoned Caterpillar operators, Jerry Crew, cut an outline of the footprint from a piece of cardboard and took it into town to the local taxidermist and tracker named Bob Titmus. So Titmus could not identify what had made the track, but supplied Crew with instructions and materials to create a cast of a footprint using plaster. So when Crew returned with a clear cast over 16 inches long, he and it were featured on the front page of the Humboldt Times, and the story was picked up by the wire services. So Bigfoot, as the mysterious track maker was dubbed, became a household word, an all-American version of the recently popularized abominable snowman, or Yeti, of the Himalayas. So Ray Wallace, he was the owner of the construction. So Ray Wallace was something of a colorful character and was known as a practical joker and prankster. If the sensational footprints were hoaxes, it was generally assumed that Wallace was likely behind it. Alright, so let me stop right there real quick and let me show you. I'll show you these pictures too as we go. The picture there, that's Jerry Crew with the 16-inch footprint that he cast. So there's a few pictures here I'll show you too as we go in through here. Alright, so in fact, the local county sheriff openly accused him of it, even though Wallace was out of the region at another job site when the footprints first turned up. So when he returned, Wallace was reportedly incensed by the accusation and vigorously denied the charge. I'll let that plane get by. Okay, so when he returned, Wallace was reportedly incensed by the accusation and vigorously denied the charge. Who knows anyone foolish enough to run his own business, man? Wallace retorted. Reportedly, 15 men had quit their jobs after the discovery of the giant footprints. I've got 3 tractors sitting up there without operators, and the brush cutting crew has all quit. It just doesn't make sense. So given the remote location, the recurring enormous tracks were a bit unnerving, even for the intrepid road crew. When Wilbur Shorty Wallace, that's Ray's brother, Wilbur. When Ray's brother, Wilbur, he reported finding heavy equipment moved about, 50-gallon drums of diesel fuel, 700-pound spare tires, large steel culverts tossed about without explanation other than the associated giant footprints. The crew became even more disconcerted. So was Shorty just having fun with the men? Ed Patrick didn't think that was the case. He described to me a curious incident. It seems that the large steel culverts were delivered to the site in pairs of fours, bundles of fours, bundled with heavy gauge wire cable, about 3/16 of an inch thick, so that's almost a 1/4 inch thick. When the cable was cut loose, it was coiled up and bundled, weighing over 100 pounds, and left lying until it could be hauled away. So Patrick and Titmus were scouting for sign of the track maker up in the mountain above the construction camp when they came upon one of these unwieldy bundles of cable. So these bundles of cable were over 100 pounds, and they found it up in the mountain, up away from the where the construction was. So, which had been carried a considerable distance up the mountainside off-road. Patrick, who was initially skeptical about the whole affair, couldn't imagine why anyone would have hauled that heavy bundle through rough, steep terrain to such an out-of-the-way location, even if someone were capable of doing it. If this were just a prank, why would the Wallace brothers intentionally or otherwise sabotage their own operation? One former logger, John Allman, suggested that Wallace planted the giant footprints around construction equipment to scare thieves. Away. If your rig was parked overnight, you might as well figure it would have no tires in the morning, Allman said. That's why this all started. When the prank attracted national attention, Wallace kept his role to himself. Allman speculated, concerned he'd get in trouble with the sheriff. So Allman acknowledged that, talking about Ray Wallace, he didn't say he done it, but I knew he did. Curious logic, since a thief would hardly notice the footprints at night. Ed Schillinger, the stake setter on the work site, said some men lived in camp at the site, and there was always someone there nights and weekends. It was more than an hour's drive over the mountain on a precarious dirt road to get to the site, and there was only one way in and out. So thieves or hoaxers would have to go right through the camp, to get to the construction site where the tracks were made. And if the ploy was directed at the thieves, why was the crew all left unawares, resulting in more than a few being scared off the job? And wouldn't Wallace expect the cooperation of the sheriff in the prevention of acts of larceny that threatened the completion of his contract? Alright, so I want to show you this too. It mentions this in a few minutes, but they could show a picture of it. So this is some examples of Ray Wallace's hoaxed Bigfoot footprints and some spherical stones that he claimed were fashioned by the Bigfoot to throw at game and kill game. So that's some of the footprints that they say was the faked footprints. Okay, so it has also been suggested that the hoaxing was actually about having a great excuse for failing to fulfill the contract. Lauren Coleman, author of cryptozoology books, says it might have been a case of Bigfoot Gate. The subcontracted work had apparently fallen behind schedule, and perhaps if Wallace could show that he could not keep a full crew on site, then he could obtain an extension. In the end, the Wallace brothers abandoned the contract and reportedly lost a sizable sum of money. In a letter, Ray claimed to have lost $40,000 on that road job as a result of the incidents. So Wallace himself offered a different rationale for his alleged footprint hoaxing. So Lauren Coleman relates that a letter from Wallace explained that when bear hunters with hounds began hunting for Bigfoot, Wallace became concerned for the big guy's welfare. He told the hunters he had made those tracks, but when he couldn't produce the fake feet, the hunters continued their search. So he determined that he would have to get some wooden feet from a friend of his, a guy named Rant Mullins, who was particularly handy with the broadaxe. He paid $50 for a pair of carved feet. So when he showed these to the hunters, they reported him to the Humboldt County Sheriff. So Wallace goes on in the letter to give the reason for his concern for Bigfoot. He was eager to follow the giant to the lost gold mines he claimed that Bigfoot guarded. So Wallace eventually moved away from Humboldt County and resumed residence in Toledo, Washington, the area where he and his brothers came from. For the next 44 years, Wallace was on the fringe of the Bigfoot community, hawking ridiculous facsimiles of Bigfoot footprint casts, bales of Bigfoot hair, recordings of Bigfoot sounds, and even photos and films of Bigfoot. He had spherical stones, supposedly fashioned by Bigfoot for use as missiles to kill game. When Texas oil millionaire Tom Slick turned his attention from the Himalayas to the wilderness around Bluff Creek, Wallace claimed he had captured a Bigfoot, but then could not produce it once a serious offer was made. His outlandish claims and antics were not taken seriously, either by the local populace or by the earnest investigators of the mystery. In later years, skeptics would point to Wallace as the ultimate source of the Bigfoot phenomenon and would pronounce his marginalization by serious investigators as a sign of shoddy or even dishonest scholarship. So according to the Seattle Times reporter, since Wallace's passing, the surviving family had now come clean, hoping to set the record straight, wishing to spare the the Bigfoot hunters' further embarrassment. They acknowledged that while it had all been in good fun, Ray Wallace had indeed created the legend of Bigfoot by donning a simple pair of wooden feet carved by Rant Mullins and stomping enormous tracks in the freshly turned earth at the Bluff Creek's construction site. They went on to assert that he had also laid down spurious tracks throughout the Pacific Northwest during his travels. Todd McKinley, a great-nephew, told reporters that numerous sets of fake feet were used to plant footprints widely. They've left tracks all over the Northwest, McKinley said. I don't know how much they did in Oregon. They've been everywhere with them in that span 20, 30 years. Reportedly, Great Uncle Ray recruited various nephews to help him sow the tracks throughout western forests. What presumably began as a mere joke took on a life of its own. Consequently, they wanted to set things right. Ray Wallace was Bigfoot, and now Bigfoot was dead. Simple as that, according to the Wallaces. So they were saying that the Wallace family was saying that when Ray Wallace died, Bigfoot died, because he was the Bigfoot, leaving all the fake footprints. So this theory was hardly news. 2 decades earlier, Rant Mullins himself confessed that he had started the legend of the giant hairy apes of Mount St. Helens in the Cascade Mountains of southern Washington. As a young forest ranger with a penchant for practical jokes, he carved his first pair of enormous feet out of slabs of wood in 1928. So Rant Mullins was saying that he made his first pair of wooden feet in 1928 to start hoaxing, making fake casts, fake footprints, followed by several more sets. According to Mullins, there were some bootleggers or some kind of outlaw types in the region, and the phony tracks were intended to scare them off. Then some friends of his used the carved feet to leave tracks elsewhere in Washington and Oregon that were attributed to Bigfoot. Mullins lost track of the feet until reclaiming them some 20 years later. It was later still that Ray Wallace bought a pair of feet from Mullins and eventually obtained the remaining feet, a disputed transaction that led to an ongoing feud between the two men. For all his whittling skills, Mullins' carved feet are primitive, to say the least. Alright, so here's another picture. So this is Rant Mullins with a pair of his carved feet. So look how rough those look. They look like a block of wood. I don't think any good tracker would be fooled by those. Alright, so they are flat and blockish with squared off toes and heels. Even Wallace observed, those things wouldn't fool anybody. Some of the smartest people in the world study Bigfoot, and Rant's feet are almost like square blocks. I've seen thousands of Bigfoot tracks, and they don't look anything like Rant's feet. I've got plaster casts of Bigfoot tracks myself. I've even got the tracks the babies make. So you don't see that very often. I'm one of the few people that show the small 6-inch footprints that are a lot of times in the ground, deeper than I can even make. And when I'm walking through there, you can barely tell I even walked through there. And yet the 6-inch footprints will be a ½ inch to an inch down in the ground, and you can see the toes on it really good. I've got several casts of them like that. Even some the ones that me and Joey were finding, 7 1/4 inch and 8-inch footprints that were pretty good in the ground and deep in the ground, and then they were also straight in line and further apart than I stepped. So you don't hear a whole lot about the baby's feet like that being found and casts made of them. So if they're the real thing, there's no point trying to fool the scientists. And yet the plaster casts that Wallace claims are the real thing haven't fooled anybody either. Although they are less blockish than Mullen's, they still are crude, stylized attempts to represent a giant foot. Wallace's casts appear stilted and rigid, with no real resemblance to an animated footprint. With minor variations, they are stereotyped, size-graded clones of one another. So Ray Wallace is connected to all this in only two ways that have been established. First, the men who first reported the tracks to the press were in his employ. And second, the events at Bluff Creek started him on his long career of producing and trying to sell crudely faked track casts and bogus photos, and telling outrageous whoppers about his adventures with Bigfoot, mainly after he had moved back to Toledo, Washington. So he's saying that's the only thing that has actually been established about Ray Wallace. So returning to that Seattle Times reporter, Young asked me for my reaction to the revelation by the Wallace family that Ray was responsible for the footprints of Bigfoot at Bluff Creek. My response was simple: where are the carved feet? I was by then very familiar with the various tracks from Bluff Creek, including the cast made by Jerry Crew that the Wallaces were alleging marked the beginning of the Bigfoot prank. I had examined numerous photographs of the original cast and even had a duplicate of the cast in my lab, courtesy of Bob Titmus. I also owned a rare copy of a cast of the same individual made by Roger Patterson in 1964 on Bluff Creek above Notice Creek, which exhibited telling variations from the Crew cast. I had spent several days with John Green, Canadian journalist, author, and longtime associate of Bob Titmus, examining and documenting Titmus's cast collection before its transfer to the Willow Creek Museum after his death. Among these were other casts of the same 16-inch individual from the hamlet of Hyampin in 1963. So this most impressive assemblage of original casts resulted from Titmus's investigation of the footprints from Bluff Creek, the surrounding environs. Some of these were found in remote locations, well removed from the construction site. I had also examined John Green's photographs of the long lines of tracks along the Blue Creek Mountain Road, taken in 1967. Perhaps the best documented incident on record. Don Abbott, archaeologist at the Vancouver Museum, also took important photos of these tracks. If the Wallaces had the carved feet they claimed were responsible for the footprints cast by Jerry, Crew, and Titmus, the others at Bluff Creek, it would be an easy exercise to confirm or refute it simply by juxtaposing their fake feet with the footprint casts. Without the feet, their claim was as hollow as any other of Ray Wallace's outlandish yarns. In addition, I was already familiar with examples of Ray Wallace's casts from news photos of his collections and from other pictures taken by investigators who had long ago looked into the matter and dismissed it. They were transparent fakes, the product of carved static models that bore no dynamic qualities whatsoever. A characteristic feature that was something of a Wallace trademark was a broad, sometimes bulbous barefoot. Okay, let me start over there. A characteristic feature that was something of a Wallace trademark was a broad, sometimes bulbous forefoot, demarcated by an exaggerated imitation of a flexion crease that appeared in some of the original Bluff Creek tracks, In the smaller Wallace cast, this crease separates the forefoot from the hind foot. Alright, so that right there, talking about a forefoot and a hind foot. A forefoot and a hind foot is on the four-legged animal. So that that part right there didn't make any sense to me. If they're finding these really good footprints and they're 50 to 60 inches apart from a bipedal Sasquatch walking, there's not going to be a forefoot and a rear foot, a hind foot. So anyway, in the larger cast, so this crease splits the ball into all of Wallace's casts that I had seen had a very stereotypical appearance, and none of them could have been responsible for the 16-inch footprints cast and preserved by crew. The Seattle Times reporter had not seen the carved wooden feet in question, but he had been assured that they did exist, and he was sending a photographer, Dave Rubert, over to shoot them. The resulting photos were very revealing to me, but this had no apparent impact on the reporter's blanket acceptance of the Wallace's claims. The carved feet were very flat and rough-hewn, with rather sharp edges, especially about the toes. The big toe was simply a broad rectangle, and the triangular little toe on the right foot was not even fully separated from the fourth toe. There were no toe stems evident whatsoever. Instead, the toe pads were separated from the sole by a wide, featureless furrow. The most obvious revelation that the carved feet were only 15 inches in length and relatively narrow. So the most obvious revelation was that the carved feet were only 15 inches in length and relatively narrow. So crew's cast was of a footprint over 16 inches, nearly 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. So it should have been plainly obvious that these carved feet had nothing to do with the documented footprints discovered at the California construction site or any other documented location in the Pacific Northwest. Alright, and then here's another photo. So this one in the center is the carved wooden foot with a strap on it. Okay, and the one on the left is made by Jerry Crew at the construction site in 1958. And the one on the right was found by Bob Titmus on a sandbar near Bluff Creek the same year. Alright, so the one in the center is the fake one, you can see that. And the one by Jerry Crew is on the right. Wait a minute, let me get that right. The 17-inch cast by Jerry Crew is on the left. Alright. So this is the cast by Jerry Crew right here. So there's the fake one, the wooden one. You can see the strap attached to the back of it. And then this is the one found by Bob Titmus at Bluff Creek, of Sandbar on Bluff Creek. So I myself have found 16-inch footprints, 18-inch footprints, and they were not castable. They wasn't good enough to be cast. They were in ground more like this right here, just around me. That's really hard. So even though you could see the footprint pretty good, you couldn't. There was no way to cast it. It wouldn't have came out. So it should have been plainly obvious that these carved feet had nothing to do with the documented footprints discovered at the California construction site or any other documented location in the Pacific Northwest. So the spotlighted carved feet do bear some resemblances to the numerous Wallace casts, such as the bulbous forefoot and pronounced split ball, but also displayed some differing traits. For example, the toe row is arranged along an arc rather than a straight edge. The proportions of the foot are more reasonable. What was the inspiration for the subtle departures from the Wallace signature stereotype? So this was pretty interesting to me to hear all this. Okay, so here's another picture, comparison of the Wallace card foot. These are all scaled to the same length. So it says the Wallace carving does not match any of the casts. So these are all casts, Bigfoot casts, and none of them match the Wallace. You say none of, Jeff Meldrum saying none of those match the card feet from Wallace. Alright, so I'll go ahead and show you this other picture. A comparison of the Wallace card foot. You can see the card foot with the strap on the back of it. And another cast of the 16-inch track discovered at the Bluff Creek construction site. And it says, you can see, it says, note the 16-inch foot stepped on and conformed to a stick. So you can see the fake one with the strap on the back, and then the other one that was cast. So you can see where the stick was pressed down. Alright, so it seems that the card feet do bear a resemblance to some of the 15-inch footprints that had been found and cast by Bob Titmus on a number of occasions, and also to the well-documented tracks on the Blue Creek Mountain Road, investigated by Green and DeHenden. Titmus had duplicated a pair of deep and distinct 15-inch tracks left in firm sand, and also the larger Jerry Crew cast. In the process, he had smoothed them over with clay to facilitate the molding process. This gave the duplicates a slightly blockier and less natural appearance in contrast to the originals that he had examined closely. Titmus had distributed a number of copies of these duplicate casts to interested individuals, and they were available. So Ray's brother Wilbur Shorty Wallace, they nicknamed him Shorty. So Wilbur Wallace presented Green and Titmus duplicate of the crew cast. Presented Green with a Titmus duplicate of the crew cast. He or Ray could very well have had a copy of the Titmus 15-inch cast as well. Could this have been the source of inspiration for the novel card feet? Clearly distinct from the classic Wallace stereotype, only unveiled years after the fact by the later Wallaces. The resemblance of the carvings to the 15-inch cast is clear, but actually fairly superficial. Closer examination reveals the wooden carvings are rather crude copies of the 15-inch cast. John Green has examined and photographed as many of the original 15-inch footprints as anyone. The stretch of tracks along the road on Blue Creek Mountain was laid in fine dust, and those numerous prints were exceptionally clear. He noted a number of details that distinguished them from the Wallace's carved wooden feet. First being rigid, the fake foot cannot change its width when weight comes on it, so it cannot make a clear print wider than itself. But compared to almost all of the 15-inch prints I have cast or pictures of, it is too narrow in relation to its length. So that in spite of the fact that the length of the toes of the wooden feet is the shortest of any. Second, it is not sufficiently curvaceous. The living foot can make a print narrower and straighter than itself, but the wooden foot could not do the opposite. Third, it could not conceivably make a wide straight groove between the toes and the ball, as occurs when the toes are flexed. Check the picture, which is on the cover of my first printing. Okay, that's on his other book. Fourth, the rounding of the heel itself is not symmetrical. All the others are, including the narrow print that shows only 4 toes, which is otherwise the closest match to the carving. In fact, the wooden feet don't accurately match any of the casts they have been compared to. So Lauren Coleman points out that Steve Mathis, a member of Tom Slick's Pacific Northwest expedition, declared 15-inch tracks he found deeply impressed in a sandbar along Bluff Creek in 1960 to be fakes. Coleman asserts these casts to be a match to the Wallace's carved wooden feet, and therefore concludes that yes, Wallace appears to have placed footprints near some of his California work sites in 1958. In 1958 through the 1960s. So the problem is the Mathis's cast does not match the publicized Wallace carved feet, but the Mathis cast is a reasonable match to the Titmus 15-inch cast. It seems apparent now that the Wallace family was unaware that the pair of carved feet they revealed to the press did not match the original 16-inch footprints cast by Jerry Crew, contrary to their repeated claims. One has simply to look at a picture of the Crew cast alongside the carved foot to realize that the latter could not have produced the former. Furthermore, the importance of a fair-sized rock protrudes into the original cast along the inside edge of the foot. A rigid wooden foot could not mold around an obstruction like that. It would either high center the fake foot or be pressed below the level of the imprint. The tracks of this larger individual were observed and cast repeatedly by different individuals and exhibit obvious variations consistent with an animated foot rather than a rigid fake foot. Additional sets of carved feet are claimed to exist, but my request to examine and photo document them were denied. Another fundamental issue remains: how were such crude devices supposedly used to produce hoax footprints convincing to professional trackers and scientists? Could the Wallaces provide a compelling demonstration of how the carved feet were employed to make the tracks that were impressed sometimes an inch or more into the firm wet sand? Apparently the media at large felt no obligation to require such a demonstration. The carved feet had simple leather straps attached to their backs and would be worn like primitive snowshoes. However, a snowshoe's ability to reduce pressure on the ground was precisely the effect wearing the enlarged feet would have on the tracks. So however, a snowshoe's ability to reduce pressure on the ground was precisely the effect wearing the enlarged feet would have on the tracks. So with that being said, when Jason was here back in March, he was really impressed with my 6-inch footprint cast that I had. So we went out to one spot where there was some sand, and we were going to try to make him a duplicate footprint or a copy. And what we were doing, and we filmed it, me making a how to make a cast. I was doing like a short video for him on how to make a cast, and we even said that that's what we were doing. We were making a cast. We were showing how to do it, and this was one of the original footprints that I found and casted. So I was trying to push that down in the sand, and all you could see was the toes and a little bit of the heel, just trying to push that in the sand. And I was trying to push it pretty hard without breaking the cast itself, and it wouldn't go in. It wouldn't hardly even go in down into the sand. So something like that is the pressure spreading out, like you say in the snowshoes. The pressure spreads out and won't go down into the sand. So that's like he's explaining there. And since this is talking about John Green too, so you might have seen it. So at the end of this, I'll tell you something about John Green and one of the documentaries I've seen him in. But let me get finished reading this first, so I don't want to distract from this. Okay, so they would hardly make an impression except in fine dust or wet mud. One reporter for a national news program appeared on screen wearing the fake feet during his story, standing in wet mud. He attempted to stomp some tracks. To his obvious discomfiture, he could hardly shuffle a step or two as the wet mud sucked onto his disproportionate and stiff fake feet, nearly causing him to pitch over. The mud awkwardly caked onto the wooden feet, and the resulting footprints could hardly be distinguished from any other rut or pothole. So that journalist was trying to make a big mockery of wearing the fake feet and showing how they were making footprints, and it turned out it backfired on him. Incidentally, examples of the larger 16-inch footprints were examined and cast by Dr. Maurice Tripp, a geologist. So examples of the larger 16-inch footprints were examined and cast by Dr. Maurice Tripp, a geologist and geophysicist from San Jose. Tripp's engineering studies of the soil properties and depth of the footprint, which he cast, show the weight of the owner to be more than 800 pounds. In his estimation, the tracks were very credible. It would be difficult to fraudulently prepare hundreds of such tracks overnight, particularly in the type of country in which they were found, he observed. So what about the impressive strides associated with the footprints found at Bluff Creek? Alright, so let me stop there. I want to show you these tracks discovered along Bluff Creek in October 1963 and cast by Al Hodgson. So these are tracks that were found in Bluff Creek, 1963. Yeah, October 1963. Alright, here's some more. Here's some more of that from October 1963. Alright, from Bluff Creek with a step length of 50 to 60 inches. So the Wallace family maintains that the elder Wallace would be pulled along, holding onto the tailgate of a slow-moving pickup truck in order to accomplish the impressive step length. So that right there doesn't make any sense. So when challenged to demonstrate this by an exceptionally inquisitive reporter, one of the Wallaces donned the feet and latched onto the tailgate. After a mere step or two, one of the feet came loose and fell off, and the Wallace himself nearly tumbled, hanging onto the truck for all he was worth. This escapade was filmed and aired on local television, but obviously didn't receive wide coverage. The conclusion was obvious. It seems the footprint hoaxing enterprise is much easier said than done. Because especially in some of the areas where these feet were found, there's no way that it could have been done like that. You couldn't have even gotten a truck in there. If you could, there would be tire tracks. Of course, even if it could be accomplished on a level road, this method could definitely not account for the tracks that marched up and down steep hillsides, presumably in the dark of night. John Green investigated a long line of tracks that generally followed a roadbed while meandering up and down the steep the brush-covered banks along the road. The track's crew witnessed approached the construction site straight down a steep incline of about 45 degrees. Coming down the incline, the track maker had dug his heels in to purchase more secure footing. So just imagine yourself wearing poorly harnessed snowshoes while traipsing in the dark through heavy brush on steep hillsides. It was rumored that Wallace had somehow rigged logging cables and a spar tree to hoist concrete-weighted feet up and down the hillsides. So never mind that the original claim is that the hoaxing was accomplished merely with strap-on wooden feet. The problem is that such a high lead apparatus requires heavy equipment, including a noisy diesel engine that eats fuel and inch-thick steel cables. It would likely require at least 5 men to operate, relying on hand signals that would be impossible to see in the dark. Such equipment is dangerous to operate under the best of conditions, let alone at night. So Wallace knew the risks all too well through personal experience. The simple fact remains there was no high lead logging operation on the Bluff Creek construction site. Al Hodgson, the proprietor of the hardware store in Willow Creek, spoke to a member of the road crew on Blue Creek Mountain, who said he was the last one to leave at night and the first to return in the morning, and the tracks appeared overnight while he was gone. So incensed by the cheek of the Wallace's claim was John Green that he backed the Willow Creek Museum in offering a reward of $100,000. So John Green and the Willow Creek Museum offered a reward of $100,000 to anyone who could convincingly demonstrate how the Bluff Creek tracks were faked with the Wallace's carved wooden feet, or by any other method employing means available at that time, nearly half a century ago. Dismissed by some as simply a publicity stunt, the challenge and the monetary reward were and are indeed genuine. Green had personally examined many of the footprints in the ground, including on the nearby Blue Creek Mountain Road. And along Bluff Creek itself. Of one occasion, he said, "We counted 600 tracks at Bluff Creek one day in 1967. 600 tracks in one day." And that was at Bluff Creek, 1967. They showed great variation. The idea that they all could have been made by one carved foot is just nonsense. The challenge stipulates some specific conditions. The tracks must traverse a wide range of terrain, including up and down steep inclines, exhibit variation in shape, toe position, and stride length, sink into ground where human tracks barely leave a mark, be made quietly at night, in areas inaccessible by vehicle. So the conditions of the original Bluff Creek tracks. So these conditions are perfectly reasonable to anyone familiar with the primary evidence. To date, no one, including the Wallaces, has stepped up to claim the prize. So $100,000 back then, that was a lot of money. A lot more than it is. I mean, it's a lot more now, but that was a lot of money back then. So if that was real, if somebody was really faking that and knew how to do it, they would have stepped up and showed them and claimed that money. Ray's son, Michael, told the Seattle Times Ray L. Wallace was Bigfoot. The reality is Bigfoot just died when Ray Wallace died. The article spawned a veritable media frenzy and a demonstration of some of the sloppiest and downright unscrupulous journalism. The story was passed along like a message in that old party game, Telegraph. Each successive iteration of the story glossed over some fact or embellished some unsubstantiated inundue. Perhaps the most egregious misconduct was by New York Times reporter Timothy Egan. Egan at least gave the appearance of doing some serious research into the evidence behind the story, interviewing me, Dr. Henner Fahrenbach, and Dr. Matthew Johnson. After a lengthy telephone interview with me, talking about himself, Dr. Meldrum, in which I explained a great deal about the media's misrepresentation of the Wallace's claims, the straightforward lack of congruence between their carved feet and the original Bluff Creek tracks, and the ridiculous photos and films produced by Ray Wallace. Egan simply rehearsed the same inaccurate story, and in the process misrepresented my comments and attributed statements to me that I never made, as well as my colleagues. So he went on to label me and any other serious academics involved in the subject as true believers, even suggesting that we had an academic investment in the matter and therefore were prone to scholarly bias. The New York Times president, editor-in-chief, news editor, and editorial page editor were unanimously unresponsive to letters of objection. So let me show you another picture here. 2 casts of 13-inch footprints. A 13 and a 15-inch footprint on Blue Creek Mountain Road in September 1967. A 13-inch footprint and a 15-inch footprint that was casted on Blue Creek Mountain Road in 1967. All right. A contentious point of the ongoing distortion was what if any role Ray Wallace played in the Patterson-Gimlin film taken in 1967. So he claimed to have taken numerous photos and thousands of feet of film of Bigfoot. On at least one occasion, he convinced his wife Elna to don a gorilla costume so he could film her. I was Miss Bigfoot, she told reporters with a sheepish grin. But rather than show Ray's ridiculously transparent monster costume, the television news repeatedly chose to cut to a clip of the Patterson-Gimlin film to illustrate his claim. So they wasn't actually showing her in the Bigfoot suit. They would show the Patterson-Gimlin Patty while they were claiming that she wore the Bigfoot suit. So to the uninformed, the Patterson-Gimlin film became Wallace's film with Miss Wallace in the obvious female costume. Mark Chorvinsky, a stage magician and editor, publisher of Strange magazine, played up the association, claiming the Wallace's admission created profound doubts about the Patterson-Gimlin film. After all, Chorvinsky pointed out, Wallace told Patterson where to go to get a film of Bigfoot. Ray told me that the Patterson film was a hoax, and he knew who was in the suit. Chorvinsky said, in fact, Wallace asserted it was in the region of Onion Lake, miles from the film site, that it was accessible only by trail. So there was actually a logging road close by, that it was near a large boulder and no such landmark was there. It is clear from what Wallace claimed to have told Patterson about the spot to film Bigfoot that he had no idea where the film was shot. So Wallace was a bit more specific in an interview with natural history writer Robert Pyle when he said, "I know exactly which Yakima Indian was in that monkey suit. presumably a reference to Bob Gimlin. Michael Wallace, Ray Wallace's son and family spokesman, told reporters that his father called the Patterson-Gimlin film a fake, but maintained that Ray had nothing to do with it. Not all Wallace family members were consistent on this point, however, and some were confident that Ray was somehow responsible for the incident. Soon the press had so conflated the story that it was being stated outright that the most intriguing photographic evidence for Bigfoot's existence was just another of Wallace's pranks. Eventually, John Hubble, staff writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, attributed to Michael Wallace a comment that the Patterson-Gimlin film may only be his obliging mother wearing a monkey suit. Stuart Hunter of the Province, Vancouver, BC, wrote, Wallace continued the prank for years, culminating in the Patterson-Gimlin 16mm film footage of an ape-like creature walking through a clearing. He told cinematographer, radio writer Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin where to go to spot the creature, which has his wife inside a gorilla suit in the short clip that has withstood independent scrutiny. When the story crossed the Atlantic, the Telegraph reported the most famous evidence for Bigfoot's existence, the so-called Patterson film, a grainy cinefilm image of an erect ape-like creature, was taken by Roger Patterson, a rodeo rider, in 1967. It was another of Mr. Wallace's fakes, the family said. He told Mr. Patterson where to go to spot the creature and knew who had been inside the suit. The simple acceptance of this unlikely scenario was dramatically demonstrated when I presented a poster at the 2003 meetings of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists on the nature of hominid bipedalism, and illustrated a point with casts of Sasquatch tracks and clips from the Patterson-Gimlin film. Repeatedly, my colleagues would interject a comment like, but I read or heard that the film was shown to be a hoax by some guy with carved wooden feet, or it was just somebody's wife in a fur suit. Such was the general lack of appreciation of the basic facts of the matter. I personally contacted Michael Wallace, who was acting as the family spokesperson, and who, by the way, wasn't even around in 1958. I was trying to arrange for an opportunity to examine firsthand and properly document the wooden feet that had caused such a commotion. It would presumably be a straightforward exercise to determine which, if any, of the documented Bluff Creek tracks were produced by the Wallace's carved feet. So Wallace was respectful and seemingly sympathetic to my academic request, but explained that the family had been quite inundated since the media hysteria and needed time to let the dust settle. He seemed quite sincere in his belief that his father was responsible for hoaxing the original footprints, although it was based merely on an unspoken assumption, since his father never declared during his lifetime to have faked the footprints, other than when he stated that he had tried to throw the hunters off Bigfoot's trail by claiming he had faked the footprints with carved feet. So that was the only thing that he ever declared, was that he told the hunters he had faked them with wooden feet. So he also distinctly reaffirmed no knowledge of any involvement by his father with the Patterson-Gimlin film, and that he had no basis on that account for concluding whether the film was hoaxed or genuine. In the course of the brief conversation, it eventually became clear that a book and possible movie deal were in the works. Subsequently, TLP Productions announced they had purchased the rights to the life story of Ray Wallace. Initially, it was just a funny story in the New York Times, But the more we learned about Ray and the ingenious way he captured people's imagination and manipulated the mass media, we knew we had to tell his story, said actor Judge Reinhold. It's Ray's young son's discovery that his father is Bigfoot, set against the mystery and enchantment of the Northwest woods. A charming premise, to be sure, but shouldn't the world also know what Ray Wallace has said of some of his other achievements? Numerous outlandish claims were made in written correspondence to John Green. For example, he claimed to routinely feed a tame Bigfoot apples from his pickup truck window, to have over 3 hours of film footage of a Bigfoot, that he had been interviewed extensively by government officials who believed the creatures were dropped off by UFOs, to know of lost gold mines that were inhabited by Bigfoots, that Bigfoot skeletons were being sold to Pentagon officials, and that he had captured 2 Bigfoots only to have them escape. It is ironic that Wallace probably had only one successful hoax. He posthumously hoaxed virtually the entire media into believing that he was solely responsible for Bigfoot. He wasn't successful at hoaxing Bigfoot researchers, and thus left his family with a lot of worthless artifacts, silly films, hokey casts, and some crude wooden feet. Perhaps the only way his family could get some value from the stuff was by attaching a big story to it. But if that was the aim, it could only have been realized if the media could be convinced of it, without checking too closely into the basic facts and evidence, allowing experts to closely examine the document the card feet or the alleged method of planning the tracks would potentially compromise the story and jeopardize the movie and book deals on the table. So whatever the Wallace's motivation, the story provides the armchair skeptic with a simplistic explanation for a complex and vexing phenomenon. So how is it that the word of a well-known spinner of yarns, if not outright liar, is accepted as gospel, and the accounts of hundreds of credible eyewitnesses who have seen such a primate are dismissed, even when their testimonies are corroborated by footprints, hair, and scat? When it comes to the media's gullibility, it seems that Wallace had the last laugh. So it appears that was his the biggest successful hoax was that he fooled the media. All right, so all right, that was it for that. So what I wanted to say was, I'm trying to remember what the name of the documentary was. There's a documentary about John Green, and they show him, interview him several times. I'll have to look and see what the movie was. It's a documentary movie. It's got John Green and it's got another researcher too, and it's got this a friend of John Green's, a lady, and it would they would say that he would go to her house occasionally and stay at her house for like a week or so, and the news reporter that was there filming him in the house kept showing him naked. I was thinking, dang, we didn't need to see all that. So anyway, I wanted to say that, but I didn't want to take away from this hearing.
Well, it's here, January the 18th.
All right, so that's it for that.
This Sunday, but next Sunday. 21st.
Yeah, so this has been on. It apparently has been helping. I've only had just a few mosquitoes flying around me. I haven't been getting eaten up by them like I did last night. Only a few of them. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it off. And then that's it for that story. So I hope you enjoyed that. I've never heard the whole story like that before. So I hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was really interesting.